Captain J1 stood on the bridge of his ship and watched the stars. The UES Harmony was humanity's best exploration ship. It carried 300 people and enough supplies to explore space for 2 years. J1 had commanded the ship for 5 years now. He had seen many strange things in space, but nothing like what was about to happen. The bridge was quiet except for the soft sounds of the ship's computers. His crew worked at their stations, checking readings and monitoring deep. Space! Everything seemed normal until the alarm started ringing. "Captain!" called out Mira from her station. She was the ship's expert on alien life. Her voice was tight with worry. "Something big is coming out of hyperspace. Really big." J1 moved to stand behind her chair. On the main screen, space began to bend and twist. Light stretched into long lines. Then reality tore open like fabric being ripped apart. What came through made everyone on the bridge stop breathing. The alien ship was massive. It was over 1 kilometer long and made of black metal that seemed to eat light. Strange energy ran along its surface in glowing lines. The ship looked like a weapon that could destroy planets. Next to it, the Harmony looked like a small toy. "Sir," whispered the communications officer. His name was Sung Ho, and he had never sounded scared before now. "They're sending a message. It's going to every human colony at the same time." "Put it on screen," J1 ordered. The alien who appeared was unlike anything humans had ever seen. It stood 3 meters tall and looked like it was made for war. Its skin was covered in natural armor that gleamed like polished stone. Its eyes were black and showed no emotion. When it spoke, its voice was deep and rough like grinding rocks. "I am Thekmar, War Prime of the Thrakari Empire. We are the strongest species in the galaxy. For 3,000 years, we have conquered every race we have met. None have been able to stand against us. None have been worthy of our respect." The alien paused. Its black eyes seemed to look directly at J1 through the screen. "But you humans are different. We have watched you. We have studied you. You fight wars against your own kind with great intensity. You do not give up easily. This interests us." Mira was recording everything. Her hands shook as she worked. Around the bridge, the crew listened in growing fear. "We challenge humanity to prove your worth. We will meet you in combat in 3 ways. First, your strongest warriors will fight our strongest warriors in single combat. Second, your military leaders will face ours in tactical warfare. Third, your fleets will battle our fleets in space." Thekmar's image seemed to grow larger on the screen. "If you win even one of these contests, we will leave your space forever and never return. But if you lose all 3, humanity will become our servants. Your worlds will belong to us. Your people will work for us. You will join the 47 other species we have conquered." The message continued with cold precision. "You have 1 standard galactic year to prepare. Choose your champions. Build your fleets. Train your armies. We will return when the time is complete." The screen went dark. The alien ship hung in space for a moment longer, then disappeared back into hyperspace, as suddenly as it had come. For several seconds, nobody on the bridge spoke. Then everyone started talking at once. "Did that really happen?" asked Seung-ho. "How can we fight them?" said another crew member. "Did you see the size of that ship?" Mira turned to J1. "Captain, I'm reading the energy signatures from where their ship was. The power output was beyond anything we've ever measured. One ship like that could destroy our entire fleet." J1 held up his hand for quiet. "Send a priority message to Earth Command. Full data burst. Include everything we recorded." While his crew worked, J1 thought about what he had just seen. The Thrakari had conquered 47 different species. They had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and now they wanted to fight humanity. On Earth, the message reached Dong Hyun in his underground command center. He was Earth's top military coordinator. He had spent his whole life preparing for possible alien contact, but not like this. The command center erupted in activity as the message played. Generals and admirals crowded around screens, arguing loudly about what to do. "We can't fight them," said General Park. "They've conquered 47 species. We've barely colonized 20 worlds." "We have to try," argued Admiral Kim. "What choice do we have?" Dong-hyun studied the technical data about the Thrakari ship. The numbers were frightening. Their technology was centuries ahead of humanity's best efforts. Their weapons could destroy human ships from distances that made fighting back impossible. But something about the challenge bothered him. Why give humanity a full year to prepare? Why offer 3 different types of combat instead of just attacking? The Thrakari clearly had the power to conquer humanity right now. So why the formal challenge? On Mars, military strategist Hye Jin received the news while working late in her office. She immediately began pulling up every piece of information humanity had about galactic civilizations. What she found made her stomach sink. The Thrakari Empire controlled most of the known galaxy. They had been expanding for thousands of years. Every species they encountered was either destroyed or absorbed into their empire. The records showed they had never lost a single war. Hyejin spent the next 12 hours reading battle reports and military analyses. The Thrakari didn't just win their wars, they won them quickly and completely. Most species surrendered after the first major battle. Those that kept fighting were usually wiped out within months. But the challenge they had given humanity was different from their usual pattern. They had never offered a formal contest before. They had never given another species time to prepare. They had never promised to leave if they lost. On the frontier, world of New Soul, anthropologist So Young was having the same thoughts. She specialized in studying alien cultures and had spent years analyzing Thrakari behavior patterns based on the limited information available. The Thrakari were efficient conquerors. They studied their targets, identified weaknesses, then struck hard and fast. They didn't waste time with ceremonies or formal challenges. They certainly didn't give their enemies a year to get ready. So Young pulled up the exact wording of the challenge and read it again. Something was strange about the language. The Thrakari had mentioned that humans were different and that they had been watching humanity. That implied long-term observation and study. She began cross-referencing the timeline. When had the Thrakari first encountered evidence of human civilization? How long had they been watching? And most importantly, what had they seen that made them decide on this unusual approach? Her research turned up disturbing patterns. Thrakari scout ships had been detected on the edge of human space for over 50 years. They had been observing human expansion, studying human conflicts, and analyzing human behavior for decades. But what really worried So Young was what the Thrakari might have learned from watching humanity. Humans were unique among galactic species in one particular way. They regularly fought massive wars against their own kind. Most alien civilizations that reached space travel had evolved past internal warfare. Humans had brought their conflicts with them to the stars. The Thrakari had watched humans fight each other with the same intensity that they brought to conquering alien species. They had seen human determination, human refusal to give up, and human willingness to sacrifice everything for abstract ideals like freedom and independence. Maybe that was why they were offering a formal challenge instead of just attacking. Maybe they had seen something in human nature that made them curious, or maybe they had seen something that made them cautious. As news of the challenge spread across human space, reactions varied wildly. Some colonies panicked and began preparing to surrender immediately. Others rallied with fierce determination to fight no matter what the odds. On Europa, shipyard workers began converting cargo vessels into warships. On Titan, military academies doubled their training schedules. On Alpha Centauri, civilian volunteers signed up for combat training even though they knew they had no chance against Thrakari warriors. But the most significant reaction came from humanity's political leaders. Instead of trying to negotiate or find a diplomatic solution, they began preparing for war. Not because they thought they could win, but because the idea of surrender without fighting was simply unacceptable to human nature. J1 received orders to return to Earth immediately. As the Harmony jumped to hyperspace, he wondered what the next year would bring. Humanity was about to face the greatest challenge in its history. They were going to fight an enemy that had never been defeated, using weapons and tactics that had conquered nearly 50 other civilizations. The smart thing to do would be to surrender now and hope for merciful treatment. But as J1 looked around at his crew, he knew that wasn't going to happen. Humans didn't surrender easily. They would fight even when fighting was hopeless. Maybe that was what the Thrakari had seen in their years of observation. Maybe that was what made them curious enough to offer a formal challenge, instead of just conquering humanity outright. Either way, the next year was going to determine whether humanity joined the 47 conquered species or somehow found a way to surprise the galaxy's strongest predators. The challenge had been given. The countdown had begun. And across human space, 3 billion people began preparing for a war they couldn't possibly win, but refused to avoid. The year of preparation changed everything about human civilization. Within days of the Thrakari challenge, military bases across human space were overflowing with volunteers. Tai Min, Earth's greatest military tactician, found himself in charge of training programs that had to prepare ordinary humans to fight against warriors twice their size and strength. Taemin set up his main training facility in the Australian desert. The camp sprawled across hundreds of square kilometers and housed 50,000 volunteers at any given time. He had studied every piece of available data about Thrakari physiology and combat methods, and the results were not encouraging. Thrakari warriors were natural killing machines. Their bones were denser than human bones. Their muscles were stronger. Their skin was thick enough to stop bullets. They could see in the dark, breathe in thin atmospheres, and survive in the vacuum of space for hours. Most terrifying of all, they had been bred for warfare for thousands of generations. But Tai Min had spent his career studying how weaker forces could defeat stronger ones. He began developing new fighting techniques based on speed, teamwork, and exploiting the few weaknesses Thrakari biology might have. The training was brutal. Volunteers learned to fight in heavy gravity that simulated the weight disadvantage they would face. They practiced combat while wearing restrictive suits that made movement difficult. They studied videos of Thrakari warriors in action until they could predict attack patterns. Most importantly, Taemin taught them that winning individual fights was not the goal. The goal was to learn everything possible about how Thrakari warriors fought, so that information could be used in the larger war that would surely follow. At the same time, Yun-Su was working frantically in her biotechnology laboratory on Mars. She led a team of scientists trying to find ways to enhance human performance without changing human nature. Genetic modification was attempted, but the results were disappointing. Humans simply were not built to match Thrakari physical capabilities. The breakthrough came from studying human stress responses. Yun-Su discovered that human adrenaline production could be enhanced and controlled through a combination of chemical supplements and mental training. Humans in extreme stress situations could briefly perform at levels that approached Thrakari normal performance. The treatment was dangerous and could only be used for short periods, but it gave human warriors a fighting chance. More importantly, it amplified the one advantage humans might have: their ability to think creatively under pressure. Yun-Su's team also developed new armor systems based on energy absorption rather than deflection. Traditional armor tried to stop attacks completely. The new human armor was designed to spread the impact of Thrakari strikes across the entire body, allowing humans to survive hits that would normally be fatal. Meanwhile, Chang Ho was overseeing. the largest military construction project in human history. Every shipyard in human space was working around the clock to build vessels designed for one purpose: war against the Thrakari. Human ship design had always focused on exploration, cargo transport, and colonization. The new warships were completely different. They were built for speed and maneuverability rather than raw firepower. Chang Ho knew human weapons could not match Thrakari technology, so he focused on creating ships that could avoid getting hit while delivering precise strikes. The flagship of the new fleet was the UES Defiance, a vessel built using radical new engineering principles. Instead of trying to match Thrakari armor and shields, it was designed to be nearly invisible to most scanning methods. The ship could strike quickly and disappear before the enemy could respond. But building ships was only part of the challenge. Chang Ho also had to train crews who had never fought in space combat. Human naval tradition was based on ocean warfare, not the three-dimensional battles that would occur in space. New tactics had to be developed from scratch. While the military prepared for war, Narai was making discoveries that would prove even more important. As a cultural anthropologist, she was studying every available piece of Thrakari communication and behavior, looking for clues about their psychology and motivations. What she found was puzzling. The Thrakari challenge followed formal protocols that were thousands of years old, but those protocols had never been used before. They had templates for formal challenges that had apparently never been implemented in their entire history of conquest. Narai spent months analyzing Thrakari language patterns and cultural references. She discovered that their society was built around concepts of strength, honor, and worthy opposition. But in 3,000 years of expansion, they had never encountered opposition that met their standards of worthiness. Every species they had conquered had either surrendered quickly or been destroyed completely. None had provided the kind of ongoing resistance that Thrakari culture seemed to value. This suggested that the Thrakari themselves might be facing some kind of internal crisis. The evidence pointed to a warrior culture that had become too successful for its own good. With no worthy enemies left to fight, Thrakari society might be stagnating or even declining. The formal challenge to humanity might be their attempt to find something their civilization desperately needed. Hyunwoo was monitoring deep space communications from a listening post near Alpha Centauri when he intercepted fragments of Thrakari transmissions. The messages were heavily encrypted, but human computers had made progress in breaking Thrakari codes. What Hyunwoo discovered was shocking. The Thrakari were not just confident about defeating humanity, they were discussing what they called the human problem with what sounded like genuine concern. The intercepted communications suggested that Thrakari leadership was divided about how to handle humanity. Some wanted to follow traditional conquest patterns and simply destroy human civilization. Others believed that humans represented something unique that needed to be preserved and studied. Most disturbing of all, the communications indicated that the Thrakari had been observing human behavior for much longer than anyone had suspected. They had detailed analyses of human military tactics, psychological profiles of human leaders, and assessments of human industrial capacity. The Thrakari knew exactly what they were facing, and they were still proceeding with the formal challenge instead of direct conquest. This suggested that their goals were more complex than simple territorial expansion. Ki Young, working as a xenopsychologist, was analyzing all available data about Thrakari behavior and reaching conclusions that worried everyone who heard them. The Thrakari were not acting like typical conquerors. They were acting like researchers, studying a particularly interesting specimen. The formal challenge, the year of preparation time, the specific types of combat chosen, everything suggested that the Thrakari wanted to understand something about humanity rather than simply defeat them. But what they wanted to understand was not clear. Ki Young's analysis suggested that the Thrakari had encountered something in human behavior that did not fit their understanding of how intelligent species should act. Most civilizations that reached space travel had evolved past the kind of internal warfare that humans practiced. Most species, faced with overwhelming opposition, would surrender rather than fight hopeless battles. Humans did neither. They fought wars against themselves with the same intensity they brought to fighting external enemies. And when faced with impossible odds, they chose to fight anyway rather than accept rational surrender. This might be what the Thrakari found so puzzling. In their experience, intelligence led to rational behavior. Rational behavior led to survival-oriented decisions. But humans regularly made decisions that prioritized abstract concepts like freedom and dignity over survival. As the year of preparation continued, disturbing reports began coming in from across human space. Long-range sensors were detecting Thrakari scout ships on the edges of multiple star systems. The scouts were not hiding their presence. They were openly observing human military preparations. This was completely contrary to normal military practice. No competent military force would allow their enemies to observe their preparations for a coming battle. But the Thrakari seemed more interested in studying human responses than in gaining tactical advantages. The pattern of observation was also strange. Thrakari scouts were paying particular attention to human training methods, psychological preparation techniques, and morale-building activities. They seemed less interested in human weapons and more interested in human motivation. Reports from the outer colonies suggested that some Thrakari scouts had been attempting to communicate with human settlements. The communications were not threats or demands. They were questions about human culture, history, and philosophy. This behavior was so unusual that some human leaders began to suspect the formal challenge was a cover for some other purpose. Maybe the Thrakari were not planning to conquer humanity at all. Maybe they wanted something else entirely. But intelligence reports from captured Thrakari communications suggested otherwise. The Thrakari Empire was definitely planning to incorporate human space into their territory. They were building occupation fleets and preparing colonial administrators. The conquest was real. So why were they giving humanity time to prepare? Why were they studying human culture so intensively? And why were they following formal challenge protocols that they had never used before? As the year neared its end, these questions became more urgent. Human military forces had been transformed from exploration and colonization units into dedicated war machines. 3 billion people had spent a year preparing for the greatest challenge in human history. But the growing evidence suggested that the real challenge was not what anyone had expected. The Thrakari were not just testing human military capabilities. They were testing something about human nature that they found both fascinating and troubling. The formal challenge would begin soon, and humanity was as ready as they could be, but ready for what? That question would soon be answered in ways that no one could have predicted. The year of preparation was ending, but the real preparation for what was coming had only just begun. The day arrived with a spectacle that would be remembered throughout the galaxy for thousands of years. The Thrakari war fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system in a display of power that made humanity's greatest achievements look like children's toys. It was not just the single dreadnought that had delivered the challenge. 47 massive warships materialized in perfect formation, each one representing a different species that the Thrakari had conquered over their 3,000 years of expansion. The combined fleet stretched across space like a dark constellation of death and domination. J1 stood on the bridge of the UES Harmony, now serving as the flagship for humanity's diplomatic mission. His ship was dwarfed by the smallest vessel in the Thrakari fleet. Even with a year of preparation and construction, human technology looked primitive compared to what faced them. The neutral meeting point was a massive space station that had been constructed specifically for the challenge. It was built using both human and Thrakari technology, creating a structure that neither species could claim as giving them an advantage. The station rotated slowly in space, its lights creating patterns that could be seen from both fleets. As Jae-won's shuttle approached the docking bay, he got his first close look at the other delegations that would witness the challenge. Representatives from dozens of species filled the station's corridors, all of them subjects of the Thrakari Empire. They watched the human delegation with expressions that were difficult to read. The Thrakari delegation was waiting in the main assembly hall. Jae-won had seen recordings of Thrakari warriors, but meeting them in person was a completely different experience. They were even more imposing than the videos had suggested. Thekmar, the war prime, stood nearly 4 meters tall. His natural armor gleamed under the station's lights like polished metal. His retinue included warriors from dozens of different conquered species, each one representing a different failure to resist Thrakari expansion. They stood in perfect military formation, silent and motionless as statues. But Mira, who was scanning, the Thrakari delegation with her scientific instruments noticed something that surprised her. Despite their overwhelming physical advantages and perfect military record, the Thrakari showed elevated stress indicators in their biological readings. Their heart rates were increased, their breathing was slightly faster than normal, and their brain activity showed patterns associated with anxiety. The galaxy's strongest species was nervous about something. The formal ceremonies began with elaborate rituals that had been planned for months. Dong-hyun, representing Earth's military leadership, accepted the challenge on behalf of all humanity. His voice was steady as he spoke the traditional words, but everyone in the hall could feel the weight of what was happening. The Thrakari laid out the terms of the challenge with precise detail. 3 contests would determine humanity's fate. Each contest represented a different aspect of warfare, and each one had been used to test the previous 47 species that had faced this same challenge. The individual combat arena was revealed first. It was a massive transparent sphere, suspended in the center of the station's main chamber. Inside the sphere, single warriors would fight until one was unconscious or surrendered. The arena was equipped with medical systems that could keep fighters alive even after receiving injuries that would normally be fatal. Hae-jin, serving as humanity's military strategist, studied the arena carefully. The space was large enough for warriors to use ranged weapons or engage in close combat. The artificial gravity could be adjusted to favor different fighting styles. Most importantly, the medical systems meant that defeat did not necessarily mean death. The tactical warfare simulation chamber was shown next. It was a room filled with holographic projectors that could create any battlefield environment imaginable. Small units of warriors would face strategic challenges that tested their ability to adapt to changing conditions and work as a team. The simulation chamber had been used to test military leaders from 47 different species. According to Thrakari records, the average time from the start of a simulation to complete defeat was less than 30 minutes. Most species had never faced the kind of multi-dimensional warfare that the Thrakari had perfected. Finally, the fleet combat zone was revealed. It was not a simulation. It was real space combat using actual ships with actual weapons. The battles would be controlled to prevent total destruction, but the risks were genuine. Ships would be disabled rather than destroyed, but crew members could still die if their vessels were hit too hard. So Young, observing the ceremonies as a cultural expert, noticed that the conquered species in the Thrakari delegation were watching, the humans with expressions she had not expected. It was not pity or fear, which would have been natural reactions to seeing another species about to be conquered. Instead, their expressions looked almost like anticipation. Some of the conquered species seemed to be hoping for something, but what could they possibly hope for? The Thrakari had never lost a challenge. No species had ever won even a single contest, let alone all 3 that would be needed for victory. Thekmar personally delivered the final terms of the challenge. His voice was deep and rough like grinding stone, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with what he was saying. He explained that in 3,000 years of challenges, no species had ever managed to win a single contest. The Thrakari had faced beings that were stronger than humans, faster than humans, and more technologically advanced than humans. All of them had fallen quickly and completely. Some had lasted only hours before surrendering. Others had fought for days or weeks, but the outcome had always been the same. But as Thekmar spoke, So-Young noticed something strange about his body. Language. The War Prime was delivering a speech about inevitable conquest, but his posture suggested uncertainty rather than confidence. His eyes kept moving to the human delegation as if he was looking for something specific in their reactions. When the ceremonies concluded and both sides prepared for the first contest, Taemin made an observation that would prove to be prophetic. The Thrakari were not behaving like confident conquerors preparing to add another species to their empire. They were behaving like researchers preparing to conduct a very important experiment. This impression was reinforced when intercepted communications revealed that Thrakari scouts had been observing human space for over 50 years. They had been watching human expansion, studying human conflicts, and growing increasingly puzzled by something they had seen. The puzzle became clear when the full scope of Thrakari observations was revealed. They had detailed records of human wars, complete analyses of human military tactics, and comprehensive studies of human psychology. But they had also been studying something else: the way humans fought wars against each other. Humanity was the first species the Thrakari had encountered that waged wars against itself with the same intensity that the Thrakari brought to conquering other species. Most civilizations that reached space travel had evolved past internal warfare. They had learned to settle disputes through negotiation, compromise, or peaceful competition. Humans had brought their conflicts with them to the stars. Human colonies fought each other over resources, territory, and abstract principles like political freedom. Human military forces had been tested in actual combat against other human military forces for centuries. This was completely unprecedented in Thrakari experience. Every other species they had conquered had military forces that were designed to fight external threats or maintain internal order. Human military forces were designed to fight other human military forces in sustained, high-intensity conflicts. The Thrakari had spent decades trying to understand what this meant. They had observed human civil wars, border conflicts, and trade disputes. They had watched humans fight with determination and skill against enemies who knew all their tactics and capabilities. Most puzzling of all, they had watched humans fight hopeless battles against overwhelming odds and refuse to surrender even when defeat was certain. Other species would calculate the costs and benefits of continued resistance and make rational decisions to minimize losses. Humans would fight until they were physically unable to continue, then reorganize and attack again. This behavior did not fit Thrakari understanding of intelligent species. Intelligence should lead to rational decision-making. Rational decision-making should lead to survival-oriented choices. But humans regularly chose to fight when fighting was irrational, and surrender would have been the logical choice. The formal challenge was the Thrakari attempt to understand this puzzle. They were not just testing human military capabilities. They were testing human psychology under extreme pressure. They wanted to see if humans would behave rationally when faced with absolutely certain defeat, or if they would continue to behave in the irrational ways that had made them so interesting to observe. As the first day of the challenge ended and both sides prepared for the contests to begin, the representatives of the conquered species gathered in small groups throughout the station. Their conversations were quiet, but human intelligence officers managed to record fragments of what they were saying. The conquered species were talking about hope. For the first time in 3,000 years, they were seeing the Thrakari face, opponents who might not behave according to the established patterns. They had seen their own species surrender when surrender was rational, and they had seen the Thrakari respond to that surrender with efficient conquest and integration. But They had also heard about human behavior from the Thrakari reports. They knew that humans had spent a year preparing for a challenge they could not possibly win. They knew that human volunteers had signed up for combat training, even though they had no chance of surviving against Thrakari warriors. Most importantly, they knew that humanity had chosen to fight rather than surrender, even though surrender would have been the rational choice. This was something none of their own species had done when faced with the same challenge. The contests would begin tomorrow, and everyone expected the same results that had occurred 47 times before. But for the first time in millennia, there was a possibility that something different might happen. Not because humans were stronger or smarter than the species that had come before them, but because they might be too stubborn to recognize when they had been defeated. The individual combat phase began at dawn on the second day. The transparent arena hung in the center of the station like a giant bubble filled with artificial atmosphere. Representatives from both fleets gathered in the observation galleries to witness what everyone expected would be a quick and decisive demonstration of Thrakari superiority. Chang Wu stepped into the arena first. He was Earth's heavyweight martial arts champion and had spent the entire year of preparation training specifically for this moment. His enhanced armor gleamed under the arena lights, and his modified weapons were the best that human technology could produce. He had volunteered knowing he would probably die, but also knowing that someone had to go first. His opponent was Vectar, a Thrakari warrior who had killed representatives from 12 different species in previous challenges. Vectar stood almost a full meter taller than Chang Wu, and his natural armor was thicker than anything humans could manufacture. When he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator that had never known defeat. The fight began with Chang Wu, attempting to use speed and agility to avoid direct contact. His training had emphasized mobility and precision strikes against larger opponents. For the first 30 seconds, his strategy seemed to work. He landed several hits on Vectar's armor and managed to avoid the Thrakari warrior's counterattacks. Then, Vectar adapted. The Thrakari warrior suddenly changed his fighting style, moving faster than Chang Wu had thought possible. A single blow from Vectar's armored fist sent the human flying across the arena. Chang Wu hit the far wall hard enough to crack his enhanced armor and fell to the floor unconscious. The fight had lasted exactly 47 seconds. Medical teams rushed into the arena to treat Chang Wu's injuries. He had 3 broken ribs, a fractured skull, and internal bleeding that would have killed him without immediate treatment. But he was alive, which was more than most previous challengers could claim. The second human champion was Jin Ho, a Special Forces soldier who had trained in zero-gravity combat. His strategy was different from Chang Wu's approach. Instead of trying to outfight the Thrakari warrior, he planned to outlast him using superior endurance and tactical thinking. Jin Ho's opponent was Vectar, a veteran warrior who had conquered species that were naturally stronger than Thrakari. The fight began with Jin Ho using hit-and-run tactics, striking quickly and then retreating before his opponent could respond effectively. For almost 2 minutes, the strategy worked. Jin Ho managed to land dozens of hits while avoiding serious damage from Vectar's attacks. The human's enhanced stamina allowed him to maintain a high pace of activity that seemed to frustrate his larger opponent. But Thrakari warriors were bred for sustained combat. Vectar began to predict Jin Ho's movement patterns and gradually closed off his escape routes. When the Thrakari finally cornered the human, the end came quickly. A single grab followed by a crushing blow left Jin Ho unconscious and severely injured. Yunsu watched the medical readings with growing horror. Even with all the biotechnological enhancements her team had developed, humans were simply outclassed in every physical category. The Thrakari warriors were faster, stronger, tougher, and more experienced than anything humanity could field. But Nare, observing from the cultural exchange section, noticed something that the others missed. After each victory, the Thrakari warriors looked to their war prime not with triumph or satisfaction, but with expressions that seemed almost disappointed. This was not the behavior she had expected from victorious warriors. Thrakari culture, supposedly, valued strength and combat prowess above all else. Defeating inferior opponents should have been a source of pride and celebration. Instead, the warriors seemed to be going through the motions of a ritual that no longer held meaning for them. The tactical warfare simulations began the next day. Hyun-woo led a squad of humanity's best soldiers through a series of combat scenarios that had been used to test 47 previous species. The simulation chamber could create any battlefield environment and could adjust conditions in real time to test adaptability and decision-making under pressure. The first scenario was urban warfare in a devastated city. Hyun-woo's team had to capture and hold key positions while facing overwhelming opposition. The human soldiers used tactics that had been developed through years of actual combat experience against other human forces. For the first hour, they performed better than expected. Their coordination was excellent, their tactical thinking was creative, and their determination was absolute. They adapted quickly to changing conditions and found innovative solutions to complex problems. But the Thrakari forces they faced were not limited by human physical constraints. Thrakari warriors could leap over buildings, see in complete darkness, and communicate through biological networks that humans could not intercept or disrupt. They could survive explosions that would kill humans instantly and continue fighting with injuries that would incapacitate human soldiers. Gradually, the human positions were overrun. Hyun-woo's team fought with skill and courage, but they were fighting an enemy that could do things that were simply impossible for humans to match. When the simulation ended, all the human soldiers were marked as casualties. The second scenario was space combat between small units of fighters. Human pilots had trained extensively in zero-gravity warfare and had developed tactics specifically for fighting in three-dimensional space. Their ships were fast and maneuverable, designed to avoid direct confrontation with superior firepower. Again, the humans performed better than most previous species had managed. Their pilots showed exceptional skill, and their tactics were innovative. They managed to inflict some damage on Thrakari forces and avoided complete destruction for longer than expected. But Thrakari technology was simply too advanced. Their weapons had longer range, their shields were stronger, and their ships could maneuver in ways that human physics could not explain. One by one, the human fighters were disabled or destroyed until none remained operational. Ki Young, monitoring the psychological profiles of both sides, began to see a disturbing pattern emerging. The Thrakari were winning exactly as they had expected to win. Every human response fell within their predicted parameters. Every tactic the humans used had been anticipated and countered, but something else was happening that the Thrakari had not expected. As the contest progressed and human defeats mounted, the humans were not showing the psychological responses that other species had displayed. Previous species had shown increasing despair and hopelessness as their defeats accumulated. They had begun to accept that resistance was futile and that surrender was inevitable. Their performance had declined as their morale collapsed. The humans were showing the opposite pattern. With each defeat, they seemed to become more determined rather than less. Their anger was increasing instead of their fear. They were studying their defeats and learning from them, treating each loss as valuable information rather than evidence of hopelessness. This was completely unprecedented in Thrakari experience. Every other species had eventually reached a breaking point where continued resistance became psychologically impossible. The humans seemed to be approaching a different kind of breaking point, one where they would fight even harder rather than give up. Tekmar was observed in heated discussions with his senior warriors after the second day of contests. Intercepted. Communications suggested that they were troubled by human psychological responses that did not match any pattern they had seen in 3,000 years of conquest. The Thrakari had conquered species that were stronger than humans, more advanced than humans, and more numerous than humans. But they had never conquered a species that responded to defeat by becoming more determined to fight. So-young finally understood what she had been seeing in the expressions of the conquered species. It was not just hope, it was recognition. They were seeing something in human behavior that reminded them of what they had lost when they surrendered to the Thrakari. Most species, when faced with overwhelming opposition, had made rational calculations about survival and decided that submission was preferable to destruction. This was logical, sensible, and had allowed their civilizations to continue existing under Thrakari rule. But it had also cost them something that they had not realized was important until they saw humans facing the same choice. It had cost them their willingness to fight for abstract principles like freedom and dignity, even when fighting was hopeless. The conquered species were watching humans refuse to make the rational choice, and it was reminding them of what they had been before they learned to accept defeat as inevitable. The fleet combat phase was scheduled to begin the next day. Humanity had lost every individual contest and every tactical simulation. According to the terms of the challenge, they needed to win the fleet combat phase completely to avoid conquest. But something had changed in the dynamic between the two species. The Thrakari were no longer behaving like confident conquerors preparing to add another species to their empire. They were beginning to look worried about something that had nothing to do with military victory or defeat. Chang Ho prepared his fleet for what everyone expected would be the final phase of humanity's defeat. But as he studied the tactical displays and reviewed the performance of his crews, he began to suspect that victory and defeat might not be the most important outcomes of what was about to happen. The Thrakari had come to test humanity's strength and had found exactly what they had expected to find. But they had also found something they had not expected, and it was making them question everything they thought they knew about conquest and resistance. The final phase would begin tomorrow, and everyone expected it to end the same way as the previous 47 challenges. But for the first time in 3,000 years, the outcome was no longer the most important question. The real question was what the Thrakari would do when they finally understood what they had discovered. The fleet combat phase began with Chang Ho commanding humanity's newest and most advanced warships against a Thrakari battle group. The human fleet had been built using every innovation that a year of desperate preparation could produce. The ships were fast, well-armed, and crewed by the best pilots humanity had ever trained. It did not matter. The engagement lasted 3 hours, which was longer than most previous species had managed, but the outcome was never in doubt. Thrakari weapons could destroy human ships from distances that made return fire impossible. Their shields could absorb the full firepower of the human fleet without showing significant damage. Their tactics had been refined through 3,000 years of successful conquest. One by one, the human ships were systematically disabled. Chang Ho watched his fleet being torn apart and knew there was nothing he could do to change the outcome. His flagship, the UES Defiance, was the last ship still fighting when the Thrakari finally closed in for the killing blow. But instead of destroying the ship completely, the Thrakari disabled its weapons and engines, leaving the crew alive but helpless. Chang Ho prepared to transmit humanity's formal surrender to Thekmar, accepting the terms of conquest that had been agreed upon before the challenge began. Then something happened that no one had expected. Thekmar requested a private meeting with the human leadership. The request came through official diplomatic channels and followed proper protocols, but it was completely unprecedented. In 3,000 years of challenges, no Thrakari war prime had ever asked to meet privately with defeated opponents. The standard procedure was for the conquered species to formally surrender, followed by immediate integration into the Thrakari Empire. Jae-won, Dong-hyun, and the other human leaders were escorted to a secure chamber aboard the neutral station. They expected to discuss the terms of humanity's surrender and the timeline for Thrakari occupation of human space. Instead, they found themselves facing something that would reshape their understanding of everything that had happened. Thekmar entered the chamber and removed his ceremonial battle helm. Without the armor that made him look like a living weapon, he seemed somehow smaller and more vulnerable. When he spoke, his voice carried an emotion that humans had never heard from a Thrakari before. "We surrender," he said. The humans stared at him in confusion and disbelief. Surrender made no sense. The Thrakari had won every contest. They had defeated humanity completely and decisively. According to the terms of the challenge, they now had the right to conquer human space and integrate humanity into their empire. Thekmar continued speaking, and what he said changed everything the humans thought they knew about the galaxy and their place in it. The Thrakari had not come to conquer humanity. They had come seeking something that their civilization desperately needed but could no longer find anywhere in the galaxy. They had come looking for defeat. Mira listened in amazement as the War Prime explained that Thrakari civilization was dying, not from disease or resource depletion or external threats, but from something far more dangerous to a warrior culture. They were dying from the absence of worthy opposition. For over a century, Thrakari expansion had slowed as they encountered a disturbing truth. There were no more species left in the galaxy that could provide the kind of resistance that Thrakari culture required to remain healthy and strong. The Thrakari had evolved as a warrior species. Their entire civilization was built around concepts of honor, strength, and the glory of battle against worthy opponents. But they had become so successful at conquest that they had eliminated the very thing that gave their culture meaning. Conquered. Species were integrated efficiently into the empire. Their resources were harvested, their populations were managed, and their worlds became productive parts of Thrakari space. But none of them provided the ongoing challenge that Thrakari warriors needed to maintain their edge, the warrior culture. That had made them the galaxy's dominant species, was slowly atrophying from lack of genuine opposition. Thrakari birth rates were declining, their military innovation was stagnating, and their society was showing signs of the same decadence that had destroyed other successful civilizations throughout galactic history. Donghyun was the first to understand what Thekmar was really saying. "You've been looking for someone who wouldn't give up." The War Prime confirmed what human observers had suspected during the challenge. Thrakari scouts had spent decades studying human conflicts, watching humans wage war against each other with a ferocity and determination that impressed even hardened Thrakari veterans. Most species that achieved space travel had evolved past the kind of internal warfare that humans practiced regularly. They had learned to settle disputes through negotiation, compromise, or peaceful competition. War was seen as a last resort to be avoided whenever possible. Humans were different. They fought wars against their own kind over territory, resources, and abstract concepts like political freedom and religious beliefs. More importantly, they fought these wars with the same intensity and commitment that the Thrakari brought to conquering alien species. Hyejin realized the implications of what they were hearing. Every other species you challenged accepted defeat. As inevitable once they lost the contests. We kept fighting because we couldn't conceive of surrender. Thekmar revealed the truth that had brought the entire Thrakari empire to human space. They were not conquerors seeking another client species. They were a dying civilization seeking salvation through the discovery of worthy opponents who could provide the ongoing resistance that their culture needed to survive. But the revelation went deeper than anyone had expected. Taemin pressed for details about the 47 previous challenges, and what he learned changed everything they thought they knew about galactic history. The Thrakari had not conquered those species through military superiority alone. They had conquered them because, when faced with overwhelming odds, those species had made rational calculations about survival and accepted defeat as the logical choice. Every previous species had possessed the military capability to continue fighting, even after losing the formal challenges. But they had chosen not to fight because continued resistance seemed pointless when victory was impossible. Humans were. The first species that treated defeat as merely another obstacle to overcome rather than evidence that continued resistance was futile. So Young was the first to understand the full implications of what Thekmar had revealed. The Thrakari Empire was not held together by military force alone. It was held together by the psychological acceptance of defeat by the conquered species. If those species rediscovered the willingness to fight even when victory seemed impossible, the entire structure of Thrakari dominance could collapse overnight. Ki Young, working with Thrakari cultural experts who had been brought in to facilitate the discussion, began to understand the crisis facing Thrakari civilization. They had become victims of their own success, trapped in a cycle where victory led to stagnation, and stagnation led to decline. The formal challenge to humanity had been their attempt to find a solution to this crisis. They had hoped to find opponents who could provide ongoing resistance without requiring complete conquest. They wanted to find a species that would fight back continuously, providing the challenge that Thrakari culture needed while remaining within the empire structure. But humans had done something unexpected. Instead of accepting defeat and integration, they had responded to the challenge by becoming even more determined to resist. Even after losing every contest, they were still looking for ways to continue fighting. This was exactly what Thrakari civilization needed, but it was also exactly what the Thrakari Empire could not survive. A species that refused to accept defeat would inevitably inspire other conquered species to rediscover their own willingness to resist. Nare began to understand why the conquered species had been watching the human delegation with such intense interest. They had been waiting for decades or centuries for someone to demonstrate that the Thrakari could be defied successfully. Not defeated in battle, which was probably impossible given Thrakari military advantages, but defied in the sense of refusing to accept that defeat meant the end of resistance. The challenge had ended with humanity's military defeat, but it had also demonstrated something that could reshape galactic civilization. It had shown that the Thrakari Empire was based not on military dominance alone, but on the psychological acceptance of that dominance by conquered peoples. Thekmar revealed the final piece of the puzzle that explained everything that had happened. The Thrakari Empire was already beginning to experience rebellions from species that had been peacefully integrated for centuries. News of the human challenge had spread throughout Thrakari space, and conquered species were beginning to ask questions that they had not asked for generations. Why had they accepted defeat as final? Why had they stopped fighting when continued resistance was still possible? What would happen if they rediscovered the determination that humans had never lost? The War Prime made a request that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. He asked for humanity's help in transforming Thrakari civilization from a conquering empire into something that could survive and thrive without requiring the conquest of other species. The galaxy's strongest species had challenged humanity to find what could be broken and conquered. Instead, they had found something that could not be broken, and it was forcing them to confront the truth about what they had become. They had found the answer to their crisis, but implementing that answer would require abandoning everything that had made them the galaxy's dominant power. The question now was whether they had the courage to surrender their empire in order to save their civilization. So Young was the first to understand the full meaning of the Thrakari Challenge title. The galaxy's strongest species challenged humans. We're still finding that was not incomplete because the Thrakari had forgotten to finish it. It was incomplete because they themselves did not know what word should come at the end. Bodies was not the right word. Neither was strength or weapons or ships or any of the physical things that most species would expect to find after a military challenge. The Thrakari had been searching for something that had no direct translation in their language or in most galactic languages. Ki Young worked with Thrakari cultural experts to understand the concept that had driven them to seek out humanity. The closest human word was spirit, but even that failed to capture the full meaning of what they had been looking for. It was something deeper than courage, more fundamental than determination, and more dangerous than any weapon. The Thrakari had challenged humanity, expecting to find bodies they could break, minds they could defeat, and wills they could crush. Instead, they had discovered something that existed beyond physical defeat or mental surrender. They had found the human refusal to accept that any loss was permanent. Narai worked with experts from both species to document what they were learning. Humans were physically weaker than dozens of species the Thrakari had conquered. They were technologically inferior to civilizations that had fallen within years of first contact. They possessed no natural advantages that could not be overcome through superior firepower and better tactics. But they possessed something that had never been encountered before in 3,000 years of galactic expansion. They possessed the absolute refusal to believe that defeat meant the end of the fight. Yunsu analyzed the psychological differences and found the key distinction that separated humans from every other species in the galaxy. When faced with overwhelming odds, other species made rational calculations about survival, resource conservation, and the long-term welfare of their civilizations. They accepted defeat when continued fighting would cost more than it could possibly gain. Humans made completely different calculations. They evaluated defeat not in terms of resources lost or lives wasted, but in terms of principles abandoned and dignity surrendered. They would rather fight hopeless battles than accept that some things were more important than survival itself. This was not rational behavior by any galactic standard. It was the kind of thinking that should have led to extinction rather than expansion across multiple star systems. But somehow, this irrational refusal to accept defeat had made humans stronger rather than weaker as a species. Chang Ho found himself working with Thrakari military commanders to establish joint training academies where warriors from both species could study each other's approaches to warfare. What they discovered revolutionized military thinking throughout the galaxy. Thrakari tactics were based on achieving quick, decisive victories that would convince enemies that continued resistance was pointless. Their strategies were designed to break enemy morale as much as enemy military capabilities. Once an opponent accepted that defeat was inevitable, actual fighting became unnecessary. Human tactics were completely different. Humans did not fight to achieve quick victories over their enemies. They fought to prevent their enemies from achieving quick victories over them. This created entirely different strategic approaches that prioritized endurance, adaptability, and the ability to continue fighting even after suffering major defeats. The difference was fundamental and had implications that extended far beyond military strategy. Thrakari civilization was built around the concept of decisive superiority. They became the dominant species by being better than everyone else at everything that mattered. Human civilization was built around the concept of persistent resistance. They survived and expanded by refusing to stay defeated no matter how many times they lost individual battles or conflicts. Hyunwoo discovered that several previously conquered species had maintained underground resistance movements for centuries after their official surrender to the Thrakari. These secret organizations had been studying human expansion patterns through intercepted communications, waiting for someone to demonstrate that the galaxy's strongest species could be successfully defied. The revelation that humans had challenged the Thrakari and refused to surrender even after losing every contest spread through Thrakari space like wildfire. Species that had been peacefully integrated for generations began to remember what they had been like before they learned to accept defeat as inevitable. Rebellions broke out on 12 different worlds within the first month after news of the human challenge became public. These were not military uprisings aimed at overthrowing Thrakari rule through force. They were psychological uprisings aimed at reclaiming the right to resist even when resistance seemed pointless. Jae-Won found himself serving as a mediator between the Thrakari Empire and 47 different independence movements. The galaxy's political structure, which had been stable for 3 millennia, was transforming as species rediscovered concepts like self-determination and the right to fail on their own terms. The changes were not limited to conquered species. Thrakari society itself was experiencing a renaissance as exposure to human psychological patterns revitalized their warrior culture in ways that emphasized competition and growth rather than conquest and domination. Young Thrakari warriors who had never experienced genuine challenge in their lives were volunteering to train with human military units. They wanted to learn what it felt like to fight against opponents who would not give up no matter how many times they were defeated. Mira documented the biological and psychological changes occurring within both species as they adapted to the new galactic reality. Thrakari stress indicators, which had been elevated during the challenge, were returning to normal levels as their culture rediscovered the sense of purpose that came from facing worthy opposition. Human stress indicators showed a different pattern. The challenge had activated response systems that had been dormant in peacetime human society. Humans were becoming more focused, more cooperative, and more innovative as they adapted to the knowledge that they were no longer alone in the universe. The final revelation came from Thekmar himself, in a communication that was broadcast throughout, both human and Thrakari space. He explained what the challenge had really been about and what they had discovered about themselves in the process. We challenged humans to find the bodies we could break, the minds we could defeat, and the spirits we could crush. We found none of these things. Instead, we found the mirror that showed us what we had lost in 3,000 years of victory. The War Prime continued with words that would be remembered throughout galactic history. We had forgotten that strength is not the absence of worthy opponents. Strength is the presence of challenges that force you to grow beyond what you thought was possible. We are still finding the courage to change from conquerors into competitors. We are still finding the wisdom to choose growth over dominance. We are still finding the hope that made us great before we became apex predators who had eliminated everything worth fighting. But most importantly, the Thrakari were still finding something that humans had never lost: the belief that defeat was just another word for try again with better information. The galaxy's political structure was transformed within 5 years of the challenge. The Thrakari Empire dissolved itself and was replaced by the Reformed Galactic Coalition, a voluntary association of independent species that competed with each other in everything from military exercises to artistic expression. Thrakari worlds became centers of learning where species could study each other's approaches to science, philosophy, and culture. Competition replaced conquest as the driving force of galactic civilization, and innovation flourished as species tried to outdo each other in creativity rather than military domination. Trade agreements replaced tribute systems. Diplomatic negotiations replaced military threats. Cultural exchanges replaced forced assimilation. The galaxy became a place where species could fail and try again, rather than a place where failure meant permanent subordination. 10 years after the challenge, So Young stood in the Grand Assembly of the Reformed Galactic Coalition, watching representatives from 93 independent species debate policy with the same intensity that humans had once brought to warfare. The Thrakari delegation, still led by Thekmar, had just proposed the establishment of competitive leagues for military tactics, scientific research, and artistic expression. The galaxy's former apex predators had discovered that creation could be as challenging as destruction and considerably more satisfying in the long term. The debate was fierce but respectful. Species that had once been conquerors and conquered now argued as equals about the best ways to organize galactic civilization. They disagreed about methods and priorities, but they all shared the fundamental belief that failure was temporary and improvement was always possible. Humanity's contribution to galactic civilization had not been superior technology, advanced science, or military innovation. It had been something much simpler and much more powerful: the irrational belief that surrender was never the only option available. The galaxy's strongest species had challenged humans to find what could be broken and conquered. Instead, they had found what could never be broken, no matter how many times it was defeated. They were still finding new applications for the principle that defeat was just the beginning of the next attempt, rather than the end of all possibility. They were still finding ways to build competitive civilizations that thrived on challenge rather than conquest. They were still finding the strength to choose cooperation over domination and growth over stagnation. But most importantly, they were still finding the hope that had made both humans and Thrakari great before either species had learned that some victories cost more than they were worth. The challenge had ended not with humanity's conquest or the Thrakari's defeat, but with the birth of a new kind of galactic civilization. One based on the radical idea that the strongest species was not the one that could defeat everyone else, but the one that could inspire everyone else to become stronger. And in the end, that was the most human thing of all.